She was humiliated, forced out of her seat, but within moments, the flight attendant who shamed her found herself facing consequences no one could have seen coming. What unfolded during this flight would not only change the lives of the passengers on board, but it would also shake the airline to its core. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If stories like this catch your attention, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Sophia Miller walked onto the airplane with a quiet, assured confidence that barely turned heads. Dressed in a sharp blazer over a sleek dress, her natural curls framed her face as she held her leather laptop bag in one hand and her boarding pass in the other. As she made her way down the aisle, her eyes flicked from one seat number to the next. Sophia's demeanor was calm, composed, but there was an unmistakable determination in her eyes. She was a woman who could handle whatever came her way. When she reached her seat in the first-class section, she smiled politely at the passenger beside her, placed her bag in the overhead compartment, and sat down. Pulling out a notebook and pen, she began jotting down a few notes, her focus fully on her task. She remained unaware of the occasional curious glances from the surrounding passengers. Moments later, Olivia James, a flight attendant, walked briskly through the cabin. Her sharp eyes scanned each passenger with a subtle, almost clinical precision. When her gaze landed on Sophia, she stopped. Something about Sophia caught her attention, though Olivia couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Her expression tightened, and she continued walking, her steps quick and purposeful. Olivia approached Sophia's seat, her tone polite but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Excuse me," Olivia said. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Sophia looked up, surprised but unfazed, handing over her boarding pass with a polite smile. "Of course." Olivia scanned the ticket, her frown deepening slightly. "This is for first class, yes?" she asked. Sophia nodded, her voice steady. "That's correct." Olivia's frown deepened further, as if trying to reconcile something in her mind. After a brief pause, she handed the boarding pass back, her lips pressed into a tight line as she walked away. But her body language suggested that this wasn't over yet. Sophia returned to her notes, oblivious to the quiet conversation taking place behind her. Olivia was now speaking to another flight attendant near the galley, casting occasional glances towards Sophia. The tension in Olivia's face was evident even from afar. It didn't take long before Olivia returned, this time with a more authoritative air. "Ms. Miller, could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something." Sophia blinked in surprise but remained calm. She stood, grabbing her laptop bag, and followed Olivia toward the galley. As they walked, passengers in first class exchanged confused looks, whispering among themselves. Sophia's composure remained intact as she stood in the narrow space, waiting for Olivia to explain. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat," Olivia said, her arms folded. "It seems there may have been a mistake with your booking." Sophia tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing. "A mistake? I don't think so. I booked this ticket weeks ago and it was confirmed." Olivia's tone grew colder. "I already checked. I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. I'll have to ask you to take a seat in the main cabin." The words hung in the air, and for the first time Sophia's expression shifted. A flicker of disbelief and annoyance crossed her face, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't understand. My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Olivia stiffened, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move, or I'll have to call security to assist." Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly, but with a quiet nod she gathered her belongings and walked toward the back of the plane, escorted by Olivia. The entire cabin seemed to be watching. The murmurs grew louder as Sophia made her way toward the rear of the aircraft. She kept her head high, but her grip on her laptop bag tightened ever so slightly. When they reached the main cabin, Olivia gestured toward an empty seat in the middle row. Sophia placed her bag under the seat and sat down, her face unreadable. Olivia walked away, leaving Sophia to settle into her new cramped spot. Sophia looked out the window, her thoughts clearly racing between frustration and disbelief. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen as she typed a message. When she hit send, a small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Sophia sat quietly in her new seat, her expression unreadable as the hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin. The tension around her was palpable. A few passengers cast sympathetic glances in her direction, while others quickly averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the awkward situation. Sophia ignored them all, her focus entirely on her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and made a quick call, keeping her voice low but firm. "Hello, it's me," she began. "I need a favor. Something happened and I'd like it addressed immediately. Yes, I'm still on the plane. No need to escalate yet. Just watch for my signal." She ended the call as quickly as she had started. Slipping the phone back into her bag, Sophia's calmness was unnerving, almost as if she knew something no one else did. Back in first class, Olivia was moving through her duties with a sense of satisfaction. She checked on other passengers, flashing polite smiles and ensuring drinks were served, yet her thoughts kept drifting back to Sophia. There was something about her composure that had unsettled Olivia, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As far as Olivia was concerned, she had dealt with the situation appropriately, but still, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, Sophia glanced at the flight attendant assigned to the main cabin, a younger woman named Clara. Unlike Olivia, Clara seemed more empathetic. She approached Sophia cautiously, holding a cup of water. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Clara asked softly, her eyes filled with concern. Sophia looked up, her smile warm but brief. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a bit of a mix-up, I suppose." Clara hesitated, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but Sophia's composed demeanor discouraged further probing. "Let me know if you need anything," Clara said, placing the water on Sophia's tray before stepping away. As the flight continued, Olivia remained unaware of the ripple effect her actions had set into motion. Sophia, on the other hand, was entirely in control of the situation. She leaned back in her seat, watching the clouds outside the window, her fingers tapping rhythmically on her armrest. Her calm exterior concealed the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Sophia wasn't the kind of person to let something like this slide, but she also wasn't one to lose her temper. She preferred precision over chaos, and she had already set her plan into motion. 7 minutes passed before a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We hope you're enjoying your flight. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let one of our crew members know." Sophia's eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, her expression unreadable. She pulled out her notebook again, jotting down a single line before closing it with a decisive snap. Whatever her next move was, it was clear she was prepared for it. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, with passengers engrossed in their books, movies, or quiet conversations. Sophia remained still in her seat, her expression calm, but with an intensity that hinted at something brewing beneath the surface. Olivia, however, seemed more at ease, moving through her routine with practiced efficiency. She glanced at the first-class section as she handed out drinks, feeling a small sense of victory. To her, the issue had been resolved, and any discomfort it caused was now in the past. But the past was far from forgotten. Sophia leaned slightly forward in her seat and unlocked her phone again. Her fingers hovered over the screen before typing a short, cryptic message. "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done." She hit send, the faint glow of the phone lighting up her composed face. The message went unnoticed by the surrounding passengers, who were either distracted or disinterested. Sophia's lips curved into a subtle smile, but her eyes carried a sharpness that Olivia would have found unsettling if she had noticed. At the front of the plane, Olivia approached the galley and exchanged a few words with another flight attendant, Dennis. Dennis, older and more seasoned, had been with the airline for years and often acted as a mentor to younger crew members. Olivia leaned in, her voice low. "Did you see that woman earlier?" she asked, glancing subtly in Sophia's direction. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The one I moved to economy," Olivia clarified. "She had a ticket for first class, but something about her didn't sit right with me. She looked out of place." Dennis frowned, leaning against the counter. "Out of place? What do you mean?" Olivia hesitated, realizing she had to tread carefully. "I mean, I had a gut feeling. It's better to be cautious than sorry, right?" Dennis's frown deepened. "A gut feeling doesn't mean you can bump someone without cause. Did she do anything wrong?" "No," Olivia said, her voice softening. Dennis cut her off with a sharp look. "You'd better hope this doesn't come back to bite you, Olivia. First-class passengers don't take kindly to being moved, and neither does the airline." Olivia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the in-flight phone in the galley buzzed. Dennis picked it up, his expression neutral as he listened. A moment later, his brow furrowed and he glanced at Olivia with a mix of curiosity and concern. "It's for you," he said, handing her the phone. "They're asking for you by name." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated before taking the phone, her fingers tightening around the receiver. "This is Olivia?" she said cautiously. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline executive office. We've received a direct complaint about an incident involving a first-class passenger. We'll need you to provide a detailed report upon landing. For now, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully and refrain from further altering seating arrangements without proper justification." Olivia's face paled slightly as the weight of the words sank in. "Yes, of course," she stammered. "I'll make sure everything is handled appropriately." As she hung up, her hand trembled slightly. Dennis, who had been watching her closely, raised an eyebrow. His expression was unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," Olivia muttered, but the nervous edge in her voice betrayed her. She glanced toward the main cabin where Sophia sat. Her calm figure now took on an entirely new meaning. For the first time, Olivia felt a flicker of unease. Sophia, seated quietly with her notebook closed on her lap, seemed oblivious to the phone call. But as Olivia returned to her duties, Sophia's lips curved into the faintest smile. She had just started turning the tide, and Olivia was only beginning to realize the storm heading her way. Olivia tried to shake off her unease as she moved through the cabin, but the phone call lingered in her mind like a shadow. She forced herself to focus, smiling at passengers and performing her duties with robotic precision. Yet, her gaze kept drifting towards Sophia, who sat quietly in the main cabin, unbothered and calm. It was unsettling the way Sophia seemed so composed, as if she knew something Olivia didn't. Meanwhile, Sophia sat back in her seat, occasionally glancing at her watch. She crossed her legs and picked up the in-flight magazine, flipping through it absent-mindedly. To anyone watching, she looked relaxed, as though nothing about her day had been disrupted. But inside her mind, every step of her plan was unfolding exactly as she had intended. The flight attendant, Clara, approached Sophia again. Her kind demeanor was a stark contrast to Olivia's earlier hostility. "Excuse me, ma'am," Clara said softly. "Would you like anything to drink? Maybe a snack?" Sophia looked up, offering a polite smile. "Just water, please." Clara nodded and returned moments later with a cup of water and a small napkin. She placed them gently on Sophia's tray table. "If there's anything else you need, let me know," she added kindly. Sophia's eyes softened. "Thank you, Clara," she said, glancing at her name tag. Her tone was warm and her gratitude was genuine. Clara gave a small smile and walked away, leaving Sophia to her thoughts. Olivia watched the exchange from afar, her unease growing. The way Sophia interacted with Clara, so poised and polite, didn't match the narrative Olivia had built in her mind. It bothered her more than she cared to admit. She felt an inexplicable urge to reassert control over the situation, but she knew she had to tread carefully now. The call from the executive office had made that clear. As the plane cruised at 300 feet, the hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop to the tension building in Olivia's chest. She made her way to the galley again, where Dennis was busy preparing the next round of refreshments. "Everything okay?" Dennis asked, glancing at her. Olivia hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, fine," she said curtly, but Dennis wasn't convinced. He leaned closer, his voice low. "Look, whatever's going on, you'd better hope you didn't mess with the wrong passenger. First class isn't for amateurs, Olivia. These people have connections." Olivia stiffened at his words, but said nothing. Instead, she busied herself with arranging cups, though her mind was far from the task. Dennis's warning had struck a nerve. Who was Sophia Miller really, and why did she feel like she had misjudged her? At the same time, Sophia's phone buzzed quietly in her lap. She glanced down at the screen, her expression unreadable. The message was short. "All set. They're monitoring." Sophia slid the phone back into her bag without a word and took a sip of water. Her movements were deliberate, calm, and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. The subtle tension between Sophia and Olivia wasn't lost on a few observant passengers. A man across the aisle from Sophia leaned over slightly and whispered, "That flight attendant's been giving you a hard time, hasn't she?" Sophia looked at him, her expression neutral. "It's nothing I can't handle," she replied softly. The man raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to the story than she was letting on. There was more to the story, but he didn't push further. Sophia turned her gaze back to the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds. Her calm exterior masked the quiet satisfaction she felt. The gears were turning, and Olivia had no idea how far-reaching the consequences of her actions would be. Back in the first-class section, Olivia felt her unease deepen. Every passing minute seemed to stretch endlessly, the weight of the earlier phone call pressing on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something she wouldn't be able to control. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with each passing minute, though the plane itself remained steady in its flight. Olivia's movements were more rigid now, her once confident stride replaced with nervous glances. She tried to keep herself busy checking seatbelts and distributing drinks, but her mind kept returning to Sophia. Every time Olivia glanced toward the main cabin, Sophia seemed as calm as ever, sitting with an air of quiet authority that Olivia found unnerving. Sophia, meanwhile, appeared unbothered. She continued to gaze out of the window, occasionally jotting something down in her notebook. Her actions seemed so mundane, yet there was an undercurrent of purpose to everything she did. Passengers seated nearby couldn't help but notice her composure, contrasting sharply with Olivia's growing unease. Whispers began circulating among them, though no one dared to speak openly about the tension. Olivia's discomfort reached a breaking point when Dennis approached her in the galley again. He handed her a folded note, his expression unreadable. "The captain wants to see you," he said quietly. "What? Why?" Olivia asked, her voice sharper than intended. Dennis shrugged, though there was a faint edge of disapproval in his gaze. He didn't say much, just added, "Go." Reluctantly, Olivia made her way toward the cockpit. As she stepped inside, the door closed behind her, sealing her off from the cabin. Captain Harris, a middle-aged man with a calm yet authoritative demeanor, turned to face her. His co-pilot glanced briefly at her before returning his attention to the controls. "Olivia," Captain Harris began, his tone measured, "we've received another call from the executive office." Olivia's heart sank. "Sir, she started, but the captain held up a hand, cutting her off. "This is serious," he said. "The passenger you moved, Miss Sophia Miller, is not just any passenger. She's connected to the airline's board of directors. We're under direct orders to ensure she's treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of the flight." Olivia's mouth went dry. I didn't know," she stammered. "I thought—" "Did you think," Captain Harris interrupted, his voice growing firmer, "or did you assume? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you acted without cause. That's unacceptable." Olivia opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. The captain sighed, rubbing his temples. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You'll return to your duties and ensure there are no further incidents. When we land, you'll provide a full report to the ground team. Until then, do not approach Miss Miller unless absolutely necessary. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Olivia whispered, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. The captain nodded toward the door, dismissing her. Olivia left the cockpit, her mind racing. She returned to the galley, where Dennis gave her a questioning look. She ignored him, instead grabbing a tray of drinks and forcing herself to move through the cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for a passenger in first class, spilling a few drops onto the tray. She cursed under her breath, quickly wiping it away. Back in the main cabin, Sophia remained undisturbed, her every action deliberate and measured. As Olivia passed by, Sophia glanced up briefly, her eyes locking with Olivia's for a split second. There was no malice in her gaze, only an unsettling calmness, as if she knew exactly how this would end. Olivia quickened her pace, retreating to the galley once more. For the first time in her career, she felt completely out of control, and she hated it. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder, had she just made a mistake she couldn't undo? She returned to the galley and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tightly. Dennis, who had been observing her for most of the flight, finally decided to speak up. "You've been tense ever since that phone call," he said, his tone low but firm. "What's really going on?" Olivia hesitated, her eyes darting toward the curtain that separated the galley from the main cabin. "I told you already," she muttered. "The passenger I moved has connections, important ones." Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Important enough for the captain to get involved?" "That's not just connections, Olivia," he continued, his voice sharper. "That's a warning. What did you do to her?" "I didn't do anything," Olivia snapped, though the defensive edge in her voice betrayed her. "She didn't belong in first class, and I—" "You assumed she didn't belong," Dennis interrupted, his voice sharp, "and now you're paying for it. Look, I've been with this airline for years. If you crossed someone with real power, you'd better brace yourself. People like that don't let things slide." Olivia clenched her jaw, her frustration bubbling over. "What was I supposed to do?" "She didn't seem like—" "Like what?" Dennis cut in again. "Like someone rich enough to sit in first class? Like someone who could afford to fly like the rest of the passengers up there?" Olivia fell silent, her hands gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dennis shook his head, sighing heavily. "You should have left her alone," he said. "Now you've made a mess that's way bigger than you realize." As Dennis returned to his duties, Olivia felt a wave of panic wash over her. She knew he was right, but it was too late to undo her actions. She glanced toward the main cabin again, her heart pounding. Sophia was still seated calmly, her notebook now closed and tucked away. The faint smile on her face was gone, replaced by an expression of quiet resolve. Just then a chime echoed through the cabin. Olivia's heart skipped a beat, but it was only the signal for an incoming call to the galley phone. She reached for it, her hands trembling slightly. "Galley, this is Olivia," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is the captain," came the voice on the other end. "We've received another communication from the executive office. They've requested that Miss Miller be given full priority service for the remainder of the flight. Make sure she's comfortable and personally apologize for any earlier inconvenience." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, sir," she managed to say before hanging up. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The request wasn't just a suggestion, it was a direct order, one she couldn't ignore. Summoning what little composure she had left, Olivia prepared herself to approach Sophia again. This time she knew the power dynamic had shifted completely. Whatever happened next, Olivia could feel that her role in the unfolding story was no longer in her control. Olivia stepped out of the galley, clutching a glass of sparkling water on a tray with trembling hands. Her usual poise had vanished, replaced with visible tension as she made her way toward the main cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her earlier decisions pressing down on her like an anchor. She knew this wasn't just about delivering water. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. When she reached Sophia's seat, she hesitated, the tray trembling slightly in her grip. Sophia looked up, her expression calm and unreadable. The air between them seemed to thicken as Olivia forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Miss Miller," Olivia began, her voice softer than anyone on the flight had heard it before, "I wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced earlier. It was a misunderstanding on my part." Sophia tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp but composed. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. Olivia's forced smile faltered. "Yes, I didn't mean to disrupt your experience. Please accept this as a token of apology." She placed the glass of sparkling water on Sophia's tray table with a slightly shaky hand. Sophia regarded the glass for a moment before looking back at Olivia. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone neutral. "But I think it's going to take more than a drink to fix this." The words, though spoken softly, hit Olivia like a slap. She swallowed hard, her palms beginning to sweat. "Of course," Olivia stammered. "If there's anything else I can do to make this right, please let me know." Sophia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, studying Olivia as if weighing her next move. The silence stretched just long enough to make Olivia fidget uncomfortably. Finally, Sophia smiled faintly, not one of satisfaction, but one of calm confidence. "I appreciate your efforts," Sophia said finally, "but I believe the airline will address this matter appropriately after we land." Olivia's stomach sank. The mention of the airline was a clear signal that Sophia wasn't letting the incident go. "I understand," Olivia murmured, lowering her eyes. "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." Without waiting for a reply, Olivia turned and walked back to the galley as quickly as she could without running. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and her mind raced with the implications of Sophia's words. It was clear that the situation was far from resolved, and whatever was coming next was entirely out of Olivia's control. Sophia, meanwhile, picked up the glass of sparkling water and took a small sip. She set it down carefully, her expression betraying nothing to the passengers around her. She appeared as calm and composed as ever, but inside, Sophia knew the game was shifting entirely in her favor. Back in the galley, Dennis raised an eyebrow as Olivia slumped against the counter, her face pale. "How did it go?" he asked. Olivia shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's not done. She's going to take this all the way." Dennis sighed, his expression grim. "I told you, people like her, they don't play games. You should have known better." Olivia didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the curtain separating the galley from the main cabin, her mind spinning. For the first time, she realized that Sophia Miller wasn't just another passenger. She was someone who wielded far more power than Olivia had ever imagined. And now she was paying the price for underestimating her. Olivia remained in the galley, her thoughts spiraling as she replayed the events of the flight. She had never felt so small, so exposed in her years of working with the airline. Dennis moved quietly around her, occasionally throwing her a concerned glance, but saying nothing. It was clear that he knew the gravity of the situation and that Olivia was completely out of her depth. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Sophia closed her notebook and placed it back in her bag with deliberate care. She adjusted her posture, sitting tall and composed, as if she were preparing for something. The faint hum of whispered conversations around her reached her ears, but she paid them no mind. Her focus was unshaken, her every move precise. Not long after, the intercom chimed again. This time, the captain's voice carried a distinct air of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The announcement brought a flurry of activity as passengers adjusted their seats and secured their belongings. Clara, the attentive flight attendant from earlier, returned to Sophia's row. She offered a warm smile, though there was a hint of unease in her eyes. "Is there anything I can get you before we land, Miss Miller?" Clara asked. Sophia shook her head politely. "Thank you, Clara. You've been very kind." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask," she said, before stepping away to continue her duties. Sophia's calm tone had reassured her, but the tension in the cabin was impossible to ignore. In the first-class section, Olivia busied herself with the final checks before landing. Her movements were stiff and mechanical. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but her mind was a storm of anxiety. The captain's earlier directive and Sophia's subtle but powerful words replayed in her head like a haunting refrain. She could feel the eyes of Dennis and the other flight attendants on her, though no one said a word. As the plane descended through the clouds, Sophia glanced out the window, watching the cityscape of their destination come into view. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest, her demeanor as poised as ever, despite the chaos Olivia was experiencing. Sophia felt entirely in control. Every step of the journey had unfolded just as she had anticipated, and she was ready for what came next. When the plane touched down with a smooth landing, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and retrieving their belongings from the overhead compartments. The usual rustling and chatter filled the air. The air was filled with the usual sounds of passengers disembarking, but an undercurrent of tension lingered, especially for Olivia, who was acutely aware of Sophia's presence and the looming repercussions of her actions. As the seatbelt sign turned off, Sophia remained seated, her movements unhurried. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone again, typing a quick message, "We've landed. Be ready." She slipped the phone back into her bag and glanced toward the front of the plane, where Olivia was stationed near the exit. Their eyes met briefly, and Olivia's stomach twisted. The cabin doors opened, and the cool air of the jet bridge began to flow into the plane. Passengers filed out in an orderly manner, the murmurs of casual conversation blending with the clinking of luggage handles. Olivia stood stiffly, forcing a smile for each passenger who passed, but her heart raced as she waited for Sophia to approach. Sophia didn't rush to join the line. Instead, she waited until the aisle was nearly empty before standing and gathering her things with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the flight. As she walked toward the exit, the remaining crew, including Clara and Dennis, exchanged subtle glances. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. When Sophia reached the exit, Olivia straightened, forcing herself to meet her gaze. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Miller," Olivia said, her voice faltering slightly. Sophia paused, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied smoothly, her tone carrying a weight that sent a chill down Olivia's spine. Without another word, Sophia stepped off the plane, leaving Olivia frozen in place. Dennis approached her cautiously. "You okay?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Olivia didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the open door as if expecting something or someone to appear. And she wasn't wrong. Moments later, 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence commanding immediate attention. They scanned the cabin before focusing on Olivia. "Are you Olivia Scott?" one of them asked. Olivia's breath caught. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need you to come with us," the officer said firmly. "We have some questions regarding an incident on this flight." The color drained from Olivia's face as the weight of her actions finally crashed down on her. Dennis watched in silence as the officers escorted Olivia off the plane, her stiff posture betraying her growing panic. The remaining crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what would happen next. Outside in the terminal, Sophia stood near the gate, her phone in hand. She watched calmly as Olivia was led away, her expression unreadable. The message she had sent earlier had done its job, and now the wheels were fully in motion. Sophia turned and walked toward the baggage claim, her steps steady and purposeful. She had no need to look back. The situation was already exactly where she wanted it to be. The bustling energy of the airport terminal contrasted sharply with the stillness that had overtaken Olivia as she was escorted away by the security officers. Passengers who had shared the flight began dispersing, many throwing curious glances at the unfolding scene. Whispers filled the air, but no one approached Sophia as she calmly made her way toward baggage claim. Her demeanor remained composed, but her every movement seemed deliberate, as though she were already 2 steps ahead of everyone else. At the security holding area, Olivia was seated in a small, stark room with a single table and 2 chairs. The officers who had escorted her off the plane stood near the door, their expressions professional but stern. Olivia's mind raced as she tried to piece together what had just happened. She had gone from a respected flight attendant to the subject of an investigation in what felt like mere moments. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a calculated response. One of the officers spoke, breaking the heavy silence. "Ms. Scott, we've been informed of an incident involving a first-class passenger on your flight. The airline's executive team has requested a full account of your actions." Olivia swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry and her voice wavered as she replied, I don't know what this is about. I was just doing my job." The officer raised an eyebrow. "According to the reports we've received, the passenger you removed from first class was Sophia Miller. Are you aware?" Olivia's heart sank further. I didn't know at first," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I only found out during the flight." The officer leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Ms. Miller is not only a high-ranking executive affiliated with this airline, but also a major shareholder. Her complaint has already reached the board, and they take allegations of bias and mistreatment very seriously." Olivia's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The officer continued, his tone growing firmer. "Ms. Miller's account of the events has been documented, and additional passengers have corroborated her version of the story. We're giving you the opportunity to provide your side, but let me be clear, this matter will not be taken lightly." Olivia's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. She wanted to defend herself, to explain her actions, but the words felt hollow even before they formed. Deep down, she knew there was no justification that would hold up under scrutiny. She had made a snap judgment, a judgment that had cost her more than she could have imagined. Meanwhile, at baggage claim, Sophia stood near the carousel, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was calm but carried a note of finality. "Yes, the security team has taken her in for questioning. Make sure the board reviews the footage and statements. I want the matter resolved professionally, but thoroughly." She listened for a moment, nodding slightly as the person on the other end of the call responded. "Thank you, and please send a copy of the final report to my office. I want to ensure that this never happens again, not to me and not to anyone else." As she ended the call, the first of the luggage began to emerge on the conveyor belt. Sophia reached for her sleek black suitcase, pulling it off effortlessly. Around her, a few passengers from the flight watched her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. She didn't acknowledge them, her focus entirely on her next steps. The terminal was filled with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, but Sophia moved through it with a sense of purpose. She had turned an incident of prejudice and humiliation into an opportunity for accountability and systemic change. And she wasn't done yet. Sophia's quiet strength and strategic thinking had set the stage for a reckoning, one that Olivia and the airline would not soon forget. Olivia sat in the sterile room, her breathing shallow as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. The officers gave her a moment to collect herself, but the silence in the room felt suffocating. Every second that passed made it harder for her to steady her nerves. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Olivia began, her eyes darting between the officers. "I was just following protocol. I thought she didn't belong in first class." The officer closest to her leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly made you think that?" Olivia's lips parted as if to answer, but she hesitated. "The truth," that her assumption had been based on unconscious bias, was something she couldn't bring herself to admit. "I don't know," she stammered. "She didn't act like the other passengers in first class." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before replying. "Not acting like the other passengers isn't a justification for moving someone to a different section, especially when their ticket was valid. Did she break any rules? Did she violate any airline policies?" Olivia shook her head, her palms damp with sweat. The officer cut her off. "Then you acted without cause. Ms. Miller was within her rights to remain in the seat she paid for, and your actions have put the airline in a very difficult position." Olivia's heart sank as the gravity of his words settled over her. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the facts were undeniable. Her decision had been based on nothing more than an assumption, and now she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, Sophia had exited the terminal and was now standing at the curb waiting for her. A sleek black sedan pulled up, and the driver, dressed in a sharp suit, stepped out to open the door for her. "Miss Miller," he said with a nod. He greeted her with a respectful nod. "Everything has been arranged as per your instructions." "Thank you, William," Sophia replied, sliding into the back seat with her usual grace. Once inside, she retrieved her phone and began scrolling through her emails. A notification from the airline's board caught her attention, and she opened it immediately. The email was concise but clear. It outlined the steps the board would take to address the incident, including a formal review of the airline's training policies and an assurance that Olivia's actions would not go unchecked. Sophia's lips curled into a faint smile of satisfaction. She had no interest in revenge. Her goal was accountability and change, and it seemed she was already making progress. Back at the airport, the officers had finished their questioning of Olivia. They stood preparing to leave the room, but not before delivering a final cutting statement. "This matter will be escalated to the airline's disciplinary committee," one of them said firmly. "You'll receive notification of their decision soon. In the meantime, you're suspended from duty." Olivia felt her stomach drop as the officers exited the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and for the first time, she realized how completely she had underestimated Sophia Carter. At that very moment, Sophia's car pulled smoothly away from the terminal, blending into the stream of traffic. She gazed out the window, her mind calm and clear. The day had been exhausting, but Sophia felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had stood her ground and in doing so, had paved the way for change. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was another message from the airline's board, confirming that they would be conducting a full review of the incident and implementing new sensitivity training for their staff. Sophia read the message carefully before responding. "Good. Let's ensure this never happens again." As the city skyline came into view, Sophia leaned back in her seat, letting out a quiet breath. This chapter was coming to a close, but she knew her actions today would have a lasting impact on the airline and hopefully on everyone who worked there. Olivia sat in the small room long after the officers had left, staring blankly at the table in front of her. The weight of the suspension, the looming investigation, and the sharp realization of what her actions had caused pressed down on her like a crushing weight. She replayed every decision she had made that day, each moment unraveling her confidence further. What had seemed like an instinctual judgment earlier now felt like an irreversible mistake. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, knowing that whatever awaited her on the screen wouldn't be good. It was a message from the airline's Human Resources Department, short and formal. "Miranda, please, be prepared to attend a disciplinary hearing scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Further details will be provided by email." Her hand trembled as she read the message. The finality of her actions became clear. The hearing wasn't just a formality. It was a chance for the airline to protect its reputation, and Olivia knew she was being positioned as the scapegoat. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but deep down she knew there was nothing she could say to undo the damage. Meanwhile, Sophia's car had arrived at her office, a sleek building in the heart of the city. She stepped out gracefully, her driver holding the door open for her. Inside, her assistant Maya greeted her with a smile and a stack of documents. "It's all here," Maya said, handing over a folder. "The board's initial review of the incident, statements from the crew, and the plan to change training programs. They've moved quickly." Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful as she flipped through the documents. "They know this can't be swept under the rug," she said calmly. "They're protecting their interests, but it's a step in the right direction." Maya hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Do you think she'll fight back? The flight attendant, I mean?" Sophia paused, considering the question. "Maybe," she said finally, closing the folder. "But this isn't about her anymore. This is about the system that allowed someone like her to feel comfortable making decisions based on prejudice. That's what needs to change." Maya nodded, her admiration for Sophia evident. "You've already made an impact. The board is taking this seriously because of you." Sophia gave a small smile but said nothing. She knew the work wasn't done yet. Change on a systemic level required assistance and patience, and Sophia had both in abundance. Back at the airport, Olivia finally stood, her legs shaky as she left the holding room. She avoided eye contact with the officers and airport staff as she made her way to the employee exit. The journey to her car felt like a walk of shame, her uniform a stark reminder of the career that now hung by a thread. Sitting in her car, Olivia stared at the steering wheel, her mind racing. She had spent years building her reputation as a capable and dedicated flight attendant, and now it was all unraveling. She thought about Sophia, calm, composed, and untouchable. The realization struck Olivia like a blow. Sophia had never lost control of the situation. She had been in charge from the moment Olivia made her first mistake. For the first time, Olivier allowed herself to feel something other than anger or frustration. A deep, gnawing regret settled in her chest. She had underestimated Sophia Carter, not just as a passenger, but as a person. And now she was paying the price. As Olivier drove away from the airport, Sophia sat in her office reviewing the documents Maya had given her. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the airline CEO requesting a personal meeting to discuss the incident and next steps. Sophia typed a short reply. "I'll make time tomorrow. Let's ensure this is resolved properly." She set her phone down and leaned back in her chair, her mind already moving to the future. The events of the day had been draining, but Sophia knew they had also opened a door, an opportunity to reshape the culture of an entire organization, and for Sophia, that was a fight worth having. The morning sun spilled through the blinds in Sophia's office, casting long shadows on her desk as she prepared for the meeting with the airline's CEO. She had spent the night reviewing documents, drafting statements, and considering the broader implications of the incident. To Sophia, this wasn't just about addressing her personal experience. It was about setting a precedent that no one, regardless of their position or background, should face the kind of treatment she endured. At exactly 10 a.m., her assistant Maya escorted the CEO, Richard Hale, into the room. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s with silver-streaked hair and a polished demeanor. Despite his confident exterior, there was a noticeable tension in his movements as he extended his hand to Sophia. "Miss Miller, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice," Richard began, his tone carefully measured. Sophia shook his hand, her expression calm but firm. "I appreciate you taking the situation seriously, Mr. Hale. Please, have a seat." Richard sat across from her, adjusting his tie as he began to speak. "First, let me express my deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. It was completely unacceptable, and we are committed to ensuring that such incidents do not occur again." Sophia nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I'm glad to hear that. However, apologies alone won't fix the underlying issues. This isn't just about one flight attendant making a poor decision. It's about the environment that allowed her to feel justified in that decision." Richard's face tightened slightly, but he nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right. That's why we've already begun a full review of our policies and training programs. We're implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all staff, and we'll be revisiting our internal reporting processes to ensure better accountability. Sophia leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "It's a start," she said, "but it's not enough. I want a detailed timeline for these changes, as well as regular updates on their progress, and I expect to see measurable results." Richard hesitated briefly before nodding. "Of course, we'll provide you with everything you need." Sophia allowed a small smile to cross her lips. "Good. Let's make sure this becomes a turning point for your organization, not just a one-time correction." The meeting continued for another hour, with Sophia laying out her expectations and Richard taking careful notes. By the time it ended, there was a clear sense of purpose in the room. As Richard stood to leave, he extended his hand again. This time there was genuine respect in his gaze. "Thank you for holding us accountable," he said. "We'll make this right." Sophia shook his hand firmly. "I'll hold you to that." As Richard left, Maya entered the room, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How did it go?" Sophia exhaled, a mix of relief and determination in her voice. "It went well, but this is just the beginning." While Sophia's meeting was progressing, Olivia sat in a sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing to begin. The weight of her suspension hung over her like a dark cloud, and the silence of the room only amplified her growing anxiety. A stack of papers sat in front of her, each one detailing her actions during the flight and the subsequent complaints filed by Sophia Miller. The door opened and a panel of 3 senior airline executives entered, their expressions neutral but firm. One of them, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority, spoke first. "Miss Scott, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss the incident that occurred on Flight 287 and the allegations made against you." Olivia nodded weakly, her throat dry. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The executives began reviewing the timeline of events, asking Olivia to provide her account of what happened. She tried to explain her actions, but her words felt hollow even to her own ears. "I thought she might have been in the wrong seat," Olivia said at one point, her voice faltering. "I was just trying to follow protocol." The sharp-featured executive raised an eyebrow. "Protocol? According to our records, Miss Miller presented a valid first-class ticket. At what point did you verify this before asking her to move?" Olivia hesitated, her palms damp. I didn't," she admitted finally. The room fell silent, the weight of her admission hanging in the air. Another executive, a middle-aged man with glasses, leaned forward. "Miss Scott, the airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Your actions not only violated that policy but also jeopardized our reputation. Do you understand the severity of this situation?" Olivia nodded slowly, her heart sinking. "I do." The panel continued questioning her, their tone professional but unyielding. By the time the hearing ended, Olivia felt utterly defeated. The final decision would be communicated to her in writing, but the outcome was already clear in her mind. Her career with the airline was over. As Olivia left the room, she couldn't help but think of Sophia, the composed woman who had maintained her dignity even as Olivia stripped it away. For the first time, Olivia felt the full weight of her actions, not just their impact on her career, but on the person she had wronged. And as much as she wanted to blame the system or her instincts, she knew the truth. She had made a choice, and now she was facing the consequences. Sophia sat in her office later that afternoon, sipping a cup of tea as she reviewed an email from the airline's board. The tone of the email was clear. They were eager to demonstrate their commitment to reform. Attached was a timeline of the planned changes Sophia had requested, including the rollout of mandatory training programs and revisions to their complaint handling processes. It was a small but significant victory, and Sophia allowed herself a moment to feel satisfaction. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the screen. It was a message from Maya. "Miranda Scott has been officially terminated. Thought you'd want to know." Sophia set her cup down slowly, staring at the message. It didn't bring her joy, nor did it feel like a true resolution. Sophia wasn't vindictive by nature, and she knew Miranda's dismissal was only a symptom of the larger problem. Yet it was a necessary step, an acknowledgement that actions had consequences. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the whirlwind of events over the past 24 hours. Her decision to act decisively had been driven by more than just personal affront. It was about setting an example not just for the airline, but for anyone who might find themselves in her position. Sophia picked up her phone and typed a quick reply to Maya. "Thanks for letting me know. Let's keep focusing on the bigger picture." Miranda sat in her small apartment that evening, the termination notice from the airline resting on the table in front of her. She had spent hours replaying the hearing in her mind, hoping to find some justification for her actions, but there was none. The reality was stark and unavoidable. Her assumptions, rooted in prejudice, had cost her everything. Her friends and family had started to reach out, their messages filled with a mix of sympathy and judgment. Miranda couldn't bring herself to respond. She felt isolated, trapped by the weight of her mistakes. For years she had prided herself on being a competent professional, someone who followed the rules and did her job well. But now all of that seemed meaningless. She turned on the television, hoping to distract herself, but the first thing she saw was a news segment about bias in the workplace. It was as though the universe was determined to make her confront her actions. The segment featured a brief interview with Sophia Miller, who spoke eloquently about the importance of systemic change and holding organizations accountable. Miranda stared at the screen, her chest tightening. Sophia's calm demeanor and articulate words stood in stark contrast to Miranda's own turmoil. For the first time, she saw Sophia not as an adversary, but as someone who had every right to demand better for herself and for others. Turning off the TV, Miranda sat in silence. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done, but maybe, just maybe, she could learn from it. She reached for her laptop and began typing an email. It was addressed to the airline's board, but her focus wasn't on defending herself. Instead, she wrote a heartfelt apology, not just to Sophia, but to everyone her actions had affected. For the first time in days, Miranda felt a sliver of clarity. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how she moved forward. The following week, Sophia received an unexpected email. It was forwarded to her by the airline's board with the subject line, "Apology from former staff." Curious, she opened it and began to read. The message was from Miranda Scott, and it started with a simple acknowledgement of her mistakes. "Miss Miller, I owe you an apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable. I acted on assumptions rather than facts, and I failed to see you for who you are, a valued passenger, and more importantly, a person who deserved respect. My behavior reflected poorly not only on me, but on the airline as a whole. For that, I am truly sorry." Sophia read the email carefully, noting the tone of sincerity. Miranda went on to explain how the aftermath of the incident had forced her to reflect deeply on her actions and their consequences. She admitted to her biases and expressed her intention to educate herself and become a better person. "This experience has been humbling, and I've come to understand that the changes you are advocating for are desperately needed, not just in this airline, but everywhere. I hope my actions, though wrong, can serve as an example of what must change. I am committed to learning and to never repeating such a mistake. Thank you for holding me accountable." Sophia leaned back in her chair after finishing the email, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't naive. She knew people often apologized to lessen the weight of their guilt or to salvage their reputation. But something about Miranda's words felt genuine, and Sophia couldn't ignore that. She debated for a moment before drafting a brief response. "Thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step toward growth. I hope you continue on this path and use this experience to create positive change in the future." Hitting send, Sophia closed her laptop and gazed out the window. For her, the incident wasn't just about personal justice. It was about creating a ripple effect. And while Miranda's apology didn't erase what had happened, it hinted at the possibility of change. It was a small step, but Sophia knew that even small steps could lead to something greater. Weeks passed, and the ripple effects of the incident on Flight 287 began to take hold. The airline had rolled out its first series of mandatory sensitivity and bias training sessions for all staff, a move that was announced publicly alongside a statement of accountability. Sophia's role in pushing for these changes was highlighted subtly but respectfully in the announcement, positioning her not as an antagonist, but as a catalyst for progress. The changes sparked conversations across the aviation industry. Other airlines began reviewing their policies, and several reached out to Sophia directly for guidance. She declined most offers, focusing instead on ensuring that her efforts with this airline were fully realized. Her work wasn't about personal accolades. It was about creating lasting impact. One afternoon, Sophia found herself back at the airport, preparing to board a flight for a business meeting. As she approached the gate, she noticed a subtle shift in the way the staff interacted with passengers. Smiles were genuine, and every question was answered with patience and care. It wasn't perfect. No system ever was, but it was better, and that was a start. When Sophia reached the gate, the agent recognized her immediately. "Ms. Miller, welcome back. We've upgraded your seat as a token of our appreciation for your continued support," they said, warmly. Sophia smiled, appreciating the gesture, but waved it off politely. "That's kind of you, but I'm fine where I am," she replied. Her confidence and humility combined, as always, in a way that drew respect without demanding it. As she boarded the plane, Sophia noticed subtle changes in the way the crew carried themselves. They seemed more attentive, more engaged with the passengers. She took her seat quietly, observing the flow of the cabin as people settled in. Across the aisle, a young woman struggled to find space for her bag in the overhead compartment. Almost instinctively, a flight attendant stepped in to help her, their tone warm and reassuring. It reminded Sophia of Clara, the one attendant during her ordeal who had shown her kindness. Sophia had ensured Clara's professionalism was highlighted in her discussions with the board, and Clara had since been promoted to a senior role. Sophia spotted her near the front of the cabin, supervising the boarding process with a steady, confident demeanor. Clara caught Sophia's eye and smiled, a look of gratitude passing between them. Sophia nodded back subtly, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared respect. It was moments like this that reminded Sophia why she had pushed so hard for change. Small gestures, multiplied over time, could transform an entire culture. As the plane took off, Sophia leaned back in her seat, reflecting on the journey she had taken, not just the flight, but everything that had followed. She thought about Miranda's apology, the systemic reforms, and the messages of support she had received from strangers who had heard her story. It was humbling and empowering all at once. Somewhere in another part of the city, Miranda was also embarking on her own journey. She had taken a job with a nonprofit organization dedicated to workplace diversity and inclusion, using her experience as a case study for change. It wasn't an easy path, and Miranda knew she had much to prove, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. For the first time in her life, she was looking beyond herself, determined to contribute to something larger. As the plane cruised at 300 feet, Sophia pulled out her notebook, flipping to a blank page. She wrote down a single line: "Change begins with accountability, but it thrives on persistence." Closing the notebook, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. She knew the fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to do, but as she watched the sky stretch endlessly before her, Sophia felt something she hadn't expected: hope. The events of that flight had been painful, but they had sparked something much bigger than her, and in that moment Sophia knew with quiet certainty that the sky was not the limit, it was just the beginning.